founding artistic director of Silk Road Rising. We took the Silk Road and we used it as essentially a metaphor for cross-cultural exchange, and also, as Kelsey just said, polyculturalism. So China to Syria, Japan to Italy, if you include the sea routes. And so for our purposes today, Italy is, of course, very helpful. The title of this talk is The White and the Not Quite White, Interracial, and we're going to put that in quotes, Relationships in the World of Tennessee Williams. How did I get interested in exploring, examining, deconstructing ideas of whiteness? Well, I've probably always had a somewhat conflicted, contentious, difficult relationship to my own whiteness. My father is an immigrant from Syria, and my mother is American-born of Polish and Slovak parentage. So I am part Arab and part Slavic. I look like this, and my name is Jamil. So whiteness has always been this somewhat complicated category for me. People will define me as white. People will define me as a person of color. I kind of like the idea of being not quite white, or a gradation of white, or a different shade of white. Because, of course, there's always that question, are Arabs white? But, of course, I am also the beneficiary of what I would call white male privilege. I'm certainly the beneficiary of tall white male privilege, and everything that sort of comes with that. So whiteness is an interesting bargain for me. Some years back, and this is kind of a dramatic exploration that led to what I'm talking about today, we did a play. Did anyone ever hear of the DNA Trail? Does that? Okay. So Silk Road, we commissioned 7 playwrights, and I was one of them, and we each took a genealogical DNA test. So that's essentially a swab of saliva. You send it to a lab, you get these results back, you have no idea what the results mean, and then we would bring people, sort of experts, genetics, geneticists, and a genealogist, and a genealogical ethicist, and so forth, who came to speak to us to kind of decipher and decode what these results were. And then each of us wrote a short play in response either to the results of our tests or to the conversations surrounding them. So my short play is called WASP, which means White, Arab, Slovak, Pole. So that was part of this evening of short plays, which led to a video play, a short video play called both/and. I've always sort of identified as a both-ander as opposed to an either-or-er. And really preferring the idea that we can be both this and that, which then led to a documentary film called Not Quite White, Arabs, Slavs, and the Contours of Contested Whiteness. Both and Not Quite White live on the Silk Road website. And Not Quite White includes interviews with Arab-American and Polish-American academics, and also kind of a theatrical exploration, once again, of these questions. So in researching whiteness, I learned a lot about attitudes towards immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And a number of scholars, particularly in the first half of the last century, and of course this is the time period we're talking about with this play, coined the acronym PIGS. And PIGS were Poles, Italians, Greeks, and Slavs. And obviously the term PIGS had a very sort of pejorative ring to it, which was to reflect the negative attitudes towards immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and not just restricted to Poles, Italians, Greeks, and Slavs, but also the Irish, who of course geographically are not Southern or Eastern Europe, but had this sort of status as being not quite white, or somehow not white at all. Jews from Eastern Europe, people from the Middle East, and Spanish people and Portuguese people, kind of in, once again, these contested categories of whiteness, this kind of gradation where people would have to prove their whiteness or earn their whiteness. Now, we've all heard the term white ethnics, so white and white ethnics became the sort of binary for which people would talk about these categories, and white ethnics were deemed less than white, somehow inferior to the superior Western or Northern European Anglo-American ideal, but better than, preferable to African Americans and Native Americans. So really kind of almost a buffer between white people and black people, or white people and brown people, were white ethnics. White ethnics were perceived as being overly emotional, and of course we heard the references to emotion, illogical, animalistic, somehow savage, maybe violent even, but also hypersexualized and very sensual. In terms of the economic utility of white ethnics, or not quite white people, easily exploitable, a source of cheap labor, and people who would do the grunt work. So people who would do work that white people did not want to do. And sort of incapable of being fully assimilated, sort of incapable of really fitting into that white idea. So there was a lot of fear, and of course we can relate this today to new waves of immigrants, but a lot of fear of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and this idea that those immigrants were going to contaminate, they were going to pollute, they were going to dirty the sort of WASP purity. They were going to somehow make that less desirable, less attractive, less viable in terms of, you know, these notions of who's a real American and what does it mean to be an American. So we had a conflation in this country of whiteness with Americanness, and everyone wanted to be American, right? So, you know, the immigrants, in order to sort of prove their Americanness, they had to prove their whiteness. They had to become somehow fully white. Now, one of the ways that we would do that is we would become really, really good racists, and particularly when it came to anti-black racism. So that was part of the trade-off. It was one of the deals. I will prove to you that I am more racist against black people than you are. And that will somehow be my entry point into white. Oh my God. Oh my God. That was so amazing.
Sorry, just interrupt. So I think obviously, and then Candy was an understudy who went on just for today.
This cast is amazing. What beautiful work.
Megan's
So we have the issue of whiteness and blackness, and that of course became and remains in many cases, you know, the sort of the duality when we talk about race and when we talk about who's inside, who's outside, or who has access and who does not, and blackness becoming this category of sort of the last thing people wanted to be. I also want to speak to the relationship of whiteness, and of course this is going to get us to Tennessee Williams, whiteness and homosexuality, whiteness and gayness, queerness. Gayness always weakened the white brand. It compromised it. It once again sort of sullied it. And it really undermined white ideals of masculinity and femininity. So a lesbian or a gay man somehow undermined, lessened, weakened, subverted those notions of a sort of idealistic or idealized masculinity and femininity. Queer people were deviates, suspect, subversive, and susceptible to blackmail, susceptible to somehow being, you know, outed, and that could cause all sorts of trouble for themselves and also for everyone around them. So I'm going to move on to Tennessee Williams from that point, and I'm not an authority on Williams. I'm not here as a scholar on Tennessee Williams. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this particular play, perhaps not officially, but unofficially, The Rose Tattoo, he had dedicated to his Sicilian lover of 14 years, Frank Merlo. And Frank Merlo gave him this kind of access to a Sicilian world and a Sicilian culture that for Williams, from what I've read, was really an escape from what he perceived or experienced as an oppressive, sort of stifling, conformity-demanding, WASP, Episcopalian culture of Southern gentility and a certain expectation of behavior, a certain expectation of not being gay, not being an artist, not in any way dissenting from, deviating from the norms. So I think Frank Merlo opened up this amazing cultural window for Williams. His problematic relationship to his own whiteness, it has been argued, made him really identify with white ethnics or with not quite white people, people on the peripheries of whiteness. And I think if we look at what I would consider the two of the great, not quite white characters of the 20th century, Serafina de la Rosa and Stanley Kowalski from Streetcar Named Desire, really represent that sort of embodiment of that white ethnic territory that allowed Williams to sort of escape from a very oppressive construct, a very kind of limiting, stifling, and also explore a certain sensuality. The idea white people lived in their minds, not quite white people lived in their bodies. White ethnics lived in their bodies. And so for Williams, that was very alluring. It was very powerful. It also became sort of the canvas on which he would create these stories. So I'd like to pose a question or a few questions, really reflecting on this sort of prism of whiteness, and open this up to everyone here. So how is the rose tattoo useful for you as a reflection on either whiteness or Americanness or the otherizing of immigrants or any combinations thereof? So with what I've just said, the sort of context I just provided, how does this play become useful, valuable in terms of these questions of whiteness and otherness? Because clearly the Sicilian community in southern Louisiana were not assimilated in a way that they could draw power from, they could draw access from, they can draw a certain kind of cultural legitimacy, and yet her daughter, in many respects, I'm pointing to you, I'm just it really became the American, became the white person, had the sort of access that her mother did not. So I'd love to just open that up and see if there's any thoughts, ideas.
Well, that same thing with Rosa, one of the things we were working on with the dialect coach in particular was her duality of language. So since she was born of Sicilian immigrants, but she'd grown up here in America, she had that ability to both be Italian in her language and be Southern in her language. And that, in some ways, is what allowed her to start to become that American. Because she looked enough white, and she was able to act white. And especially with her intelligence and going through school, and then through continuing talking about how she's so successful in school, you really do see how she starts to become the not body, like white, ethnic white that we were talking about, but the mind of the true white that was the epitome in America at that time.
Absolutely.
A good example. I don't know if you, as children of Italian immigrants, have any sort of personal insights too as well.
Well, I think that I'll say this, my friend who is American but of Sicilian descent who lives in Louisiana, now he's almost 80 years old and came to see the show. And it's funny because as soon as we got out of the theater, he really enjoyed the play, but he's like, oh yeah, I remember when they called us WAPs. I mean, it hit him in a different way, because it's funny when you hear it. But because he's from Louisiana and he lived in that community, it was funny, like it kind of, you know what I mean, that it got to him. So that was very real for him in a way that, for us today.
Yeah, it was hard for me doing rehearsals. I used to get very upset hearing of it because I don't like racial, and epithets in general, and it's something that I grew up hearing myself. And I grew up my family was large and very, very Italian, but then also very diverse, too, because the Americanized people, and so Yeah, I think, and then spending a lot of time in Italy growing up, and just recognizing that it's an incredibly mixed culture that denies it completely. Two, and that we are made by everyone else, but that it doesn't, it is trying so hard to make itself one thing when it's really this. So yeah, the otherness really in this play and that this discussion has been very real to me. Yeah, and I think about often when I run in and I'm standing up for my grandfather. Right before he died, he was attacked by a bunch of white these boys that were trying to muscle him and my grandmother out of their property, their first property they had bought in Santa Rosa. And this was only 10 years ago. I'm calling them a bunch of Wapdego guineas, all that shit. So yeah, it has very much a resonance to me. And I know that they lived, as did a lot of people in my family, under a lot of stress, you know, and the fact that they found the passion and tried to commit to what was, you know, the things that they were trying to be told not to be anymore was admirable, but it also hurt them so deeply. And so yeah, it's something I feel very much in the play.
So often when we think about anti-immigrant sentiment or hysteria or anti-immigrant racism, we don't think about people from Europe, and yet so much of that history is really directed at other Europeans.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, when you're talking about history and stuff, if you look back at it, when you were talking about the Irish, who are not even, you know, in the other category, if you look back at newspaper articles, the Irish were portrayed as ape-like and, you know, the same non-human. There were signs in New York, in restaurants, no dogs or Irish allowed. People would have help wanted signs that said, no Irish need apply. If you look at things like the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, the eastern part was built by the Irish and the western part was built by the Chinese. Cheap immigrant labor who couldn't get any other job, and they were disposable. I mean, how many Chinese died, you know, blowing tunnels through the mountains to get that part done, you know. The other thing that's interesting about, you can tell what the lowest rung of society is by who the heavyweight champions of the world were. At one point they were Irish, then they were Italian, black, Hispanic, you know, it goes through there. Sports is the only way to get out of the ghetto, whichever ghetto it happens to be at that point in history.
Very good point, yeah.
And once again, I think that history gets so erased,
Yeah, you
or
forget about
untold.
that. Yeah.
And also the fact that the immigrants had to trade off, they had to trade a lot in terms of erasing their backgrounds, names, accents, language, you had to somehow lose so as to, you know, be sort of awarded that racial privilege.
The thing that I think is really sad is that those objects of racism, once they get acceptance, they're willing to be racist against the next group.
Yeah.
And one would think that being the object of that, you wouldn't want to continue it against somebody else because you understand that. But unfortunately, as human beings, that does not seem to be the way we work.
And also it affects the internal of just the way even though it happens itself already in Italian culture because of its own conservatism, but then the Italians that like surround her that are not only taking that perspective, but then the American ideal that are going, you better behave. You know, even Mr. Sicardi who's Italian, who fires me, I know he's telling me, you better act more like these, you know, you better not fight none of these white people, you idiot. Like, you know, who's trying to appropriate and let go of his, I'm sure while Alvaro is trying to not, but still, you know, people was like, why, I'm decent. I don't have to be any, right? But that, yeah, so. Totally.
One thing I thought about is that when your character says, I'm going to go call the police, when we're trying to get the dresses, and I say something like, why would you do that? You know, it's just this concept of like fear of the authority, like the police are not on your side, you know, we're in the minority. If we call the police, like, they could accuse us of something, so it's interesting.
Relationship to law enforcement.
Yeah, the structure, the power structure that's in place.
I would just like to ask anyone else, this conversation got me thinking that when I was a young adult, I'd be inundated with Polish jokes. And I can't remember the last time I heard a Polish joke.
That's a good thing.
I was wondering if anybody else had the same experience.
Yeah.
One of the scholars that we interviewed for the documentary film actually did a lot of work on the Polish joke and the kind of, the political uses of a joke that was meant to deride a community of white ethnics to essentially deflect from the racism within the larger culture. The sort of the structure of racism could be dismissed, and it could be, but look at those ignorant Polish people, look at those Polish bigots, we'll blame it on them. So oftentimes urban white ethnics became the whipping boys, so to speak, and were blamed for racism, completely detached from the institutional structures that sustain and encourage and promote racism. And they themselves were victims of racism. They themselves were, in participating oftentimes, having to take the lowest paying jobs, or at points in history being locked out from unions, and so forth and so on. They were, in many respects, experiencing much that black people were experiencing, just not as bad. Just sort of a rung or two above that.
I know we got a little off track from your question you had asked.
Yes.
But I don't know if you wanted to...
Rose tattoo.
If anyone else had any thoughts on that particular ring of thought, or if you had any other questions that you wanted to pose to the group?
I do, in terms of, how is this play helpful for us in understanding the struggles of immigrants? How is it helpful, and particularly, of course, we're talking, Italian, Sicilian immigrants, southern Louisiana, that time period, but just in general, do you find it a play that is instructive for how we talk about or think about the immigrant experience?
Well, it's instructive because this woman here was a very hard worker, and that's how they made it out.
Yeah.
If you weren't willing to do that, or work tricks on the next guy, you weren't going to make it.
That's such a beautiful point.
I love that it shows just that immigrants made the country, and that they're the ones that, while you have these peripheral people that are saying, we can call the cops and you have you deported, but it's like those stakes are huge, whereas like that person who can make that phone call, and it just, that's what I like about the play. It shows that, ultimately, losing the job, and it's all like huge what happens to them, but they still keep moving forward, which is really brave, I think, and it shows that, and I really love that about this play. It surprised me about it.
But with the latest group, like the Hispanic, it's a real threat. Where I don't think you would say that to my grandfather. I mean, he couldn't be deported.
I'm sorry.
Well, I'm saying my grandfather, he came over here on steerage, and nobody could threaten him and say, I'll have you deported.
But my understanding was that a lot of these immigrants from Sicily did not necessarily have papers.
Yeah,
not
this was
necessarily.
my
hence
whole
the law.
family.
Without passport, yeah.
Without papers, yeah. So that my whole family.
I didn't think that.
Yeah, my whole family, or Alvaro's family, is all illegal, and I think
You mean
Alvaro.
100 years ago, 120 years ago? They were illegal?
No, Alvaro's family in the play are all illegal. They're not illegal. He says that they're not citizens, no relief checks or anything. They're there right now. Yeah, and yeah.
So they're all dependent.
They can't get
They're-
welfare, right?
yeah.
So
And that's why they
there's-
don't work, and they're depressed, and there's other things. So yeah, I'm the only one that can work. So yeah.
And I think, yeah, the white characters we see in the show and it's interesting because we're talking about a culture now in this time period where the epitome was this white culture, yet in this play we see very little of it. We mostly it's on the periphery. So we see obviously the teacher, and you ladies know I don't understand Italian, which is a funny moment, but it's also like we're not actually speaking Italian that whole time we're talking to her. We're just speaking in Italian accents, and she's just sort of refusing to understand us. And then there, of course, is Betsy and Flora, who come running in and threaten to call the police and get her license revoked, which she doesn't have a license. And so there is sort of this odd periphery of these white characters and how they come in and both help mold their life and how they mold, they accuse, and they also they start to affect each other in interesting ways.
And their presence is somehow felt. And,
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
and of course, the woman he had the affair with.
Exactly. Yeah, Estelle. She's a very important character.
I read one of my heroes is James Baldwin, and he writes in one of his books a lot about the difference between assimilation and integration. And I think this play deals with that a lot. That integration is about the maintaining of the center, the heart of the culture, but not while still letting it be a part of the functioning community, but let also what it creates come back to itself. Whereas assimilation is a diluting. It's getting rid of the thing and just in control, really. And that's the huge, especially at this time, is I think the huge tug and pull to.
And the big tension with multiculturalism, sort of rejecting the assimilationist model, but looking at how many communities can coexist but maintain a certain cultural integrity or cultural.
And we actually just worked on a short
Yes.
film together that was multiculturalism versus polyculturalism, as if they were both people, as if they were both characters having a conversation. It was a first date, which is on the Silk Road website, which is a fascinating watch if you wanted to explore that dichotomy a little bit more.
Multi meets poly. And polyculturalism is really the intersection, the overlapping of cultures. What happens when cultures kind of fuse or blend or collide or this sort of thing, but the interchange of cultures. And multiculturalism is more about sort of distinct cultural communities that coexist with one another and somehow maintain, like I said, that kind of cultural integrity or, and some people would take it to the extent of like a cultural separatism or apartness, however that gets defined.
I have a question for Nick. You said something earlier about how you still have a problem with the derogatory terms and name calling and things like that, and yet when we first met, you said this was one of your favorite plays, if not the most favorite play. So, can you?
Oh, I never said that.
Oh, I thought you said that. I thought you said. I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
No, I do like the play. I did never say this was my most favorite play. I love that it was. I love the. I came to love it more as I did it, and I do love the play now. I mean, when we got introduced to it, I didn't know it very well. I had only read it a while before, and I read it, and I liked the part. I still haven't seen the movie. I've never seen a production of it, but I very much thought that for a white boy writing, an Anglo white boy writing this play, especially when it usually doesn't go so well with Italian because people don't check the language, especially, that it was written with integrity, but especially for the part, especially that he so adamantly stands up for himself even when it's going to lose everything. But I don't mean that to also say that I think the play is incredible, especially in the ride that the language takes you on to, and an inherent understanding that I think that it does have about the culture. Now, in terms of the words, I did have some things where even in the way he describes Alvaro in it, there is a bit of an objectification in parts where even he was victim of. I tend to see in his own wrestling, and I think in many of his other plays, but I think this one, it seems like maybe because of his relationship to Merlot and the culture that he let go the most of the way that stuff affected him, and he embraced it the most. But yeah, those are my only thoughts. But yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was just interested in that
transition.
transition.
To try to wrap things up, I know some people have to head out, so if you need a piece. But if you have any last thoughts or questions that you want to pose
Forgive us
to
for leaving, but we don't want a white ethnic person to buy the ticket.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Very much.
Well, it's interesting with you mentioned Merlot because some scholars who've been a little less generous, let's say, to Williams have really accused him of fetishizing or exoticizing in not necessarily the best ways, and appropriating Sicilian culture, and that it became something upon which he could project his own fantasies and he could project his own, sort of escapism. Without necessarily, kind of endowing the culture with respect and so forth. I don't agree with that, I don't know.
How the play is interpreted, I think it can be interpreted and done much more. And then, but I think because also with Eileen and I just think the whole group went into it wanting to give the story. But I think when you read it, I can see how another group could play it and make it and do that to it.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, because in fact, when people who are Italian see it, they find that it rings very true. I mean, yes, it's heightened, right, because of the circumstances of the play, and certain things might be a little exaggerated, but it's very, but it's very. I mean, that's what, like you were saying. I mean, he really does capture the heart, I think, of the culture.
Totally.
Absolutely.
And even in hearing the epithets, it's not. It doesn't bother me that they're in the play, but they just have an effect on me when I hear them. In a way that I was able to then just put into Alvaro. But I don't mean to say that I don't feel belong in the play. I think he does just enough with it, and it's correct in the way that it's used. Yeah, unfortunately, it happens. Yeah.
Any last thoughts or questions from either side of the group?
I have a question. First of all, everyone did such a great job, and I really just get to My question is, which scene is like the hardest and most challenging for you?
For me, the first quarter of the play is the hardest, for sure. In fact, in rehearsal, I was like, oh my God. Because it jumps in time, it's so heightened, and I had difficulty, probably with the Flora Bessie scene was one of the most difficult for me.
Although you wield a good broom.
I'm getting better at that. I'm not as natural. It actually, in the later part of the play, where the two-person scene is sort of, the second act is mostly two-person scenes, Jack and Rosa and Alvaro and Serafina. Those are the whole play is challenging, but it's at least a little more, where we get to sort of, it's fun in a different way. The first part, for a while, I was like, oh my God.
Well, I love the fact that we're getting together after the play because you actually inspire and make us think a little bit more. And that we enjoyed it. It was wonderful, but the actual dimension of it and thinking of it and the prejudice and background of, like we're saying, Americans, Italian, coming from different areas, and this whole melting pot and how it's very difficult to make changes. I mean, I come from a Polish German family, and I come from married to an Italian years ago. Going through all this, you kind of see all this prejudice, and you have to be very strong to say, I don't want my kids like that, and I don't want to be like this, and I want to make these changes, and be there for everybody around you, and to then make this change and leave your family. And because if they don't want to come with you, they're not on the same ride, it's pretty hard. It's hard to walk away, whether you're straight or gay or whatever it is, but to walk away from all this prejudice, because there's a lot of it, and you have to be strong about it, and you do make a difference. And I'm one of those generations that changed. My kids are different, and my family and everybody's different, and I love it.
Well, I remember, I don't know how many share this, but I remember growing up and hearing things in my family going, okay, I will never do that.
Exactly.
I will never be like that. And then as you get older, you go, oh, wait a minute, no, I said I'd never do that, and it continuously reminds you have to change and turn a new chapter, in the book.
It's hard. It's very hard to say, hey, Mom, you can't talk like that in front of kids. You can't do this and that. It's very hard.
But I think
But
there's a difference.
difference.
There's a difference between saying to yourself, that's poor behavior and I don't want to be like that, and so you're not like that. But the change isn't within yet. I think you have to get out there and meet people from other cultures and really connect with them. And once you start liking a person from another culture, it just happens.
And when you
And it's
expose your
deep.
children to that, which we did, and it was totally different. And there's all that love now. It's just
When that
they
fear
see the
disappears
world
in that.
in a different way, and they're not fearful of these other
Exactly.
cultures. That's what it is.
And when
They're
you
open.
live in a city, you're lucky because you are constantly surrounded by people
from different cultures.
Exactly.
Sure.
But I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and my friends in Ohio still think every Muslim is a terrorist. And black people are gonna shoot them down in the mall, even though there are no blacks in our community. They'd have to come from 20 miles away. And when I talk to them, I'm just stunned. You know, but they've never traveled, ever. So I don't.
You don't realize that
Yeah.
when you travel to little towns and going through Galena, Illinois, and all that. And, oh yeah, it looks pretty and go to the resort area, but the farmers and the people that actually live there,
Yeah.
they're different, and they're not open to.
The only way the
it's
change
tough.
comes is, I think, when their kids go to college and
It's
maybe
true.
get jobs and move to the city or work overseas, they
Yeah.
change.
We need to make the change.
And that's a constant process for all of us, you know.
That's
and
true.
we're
But
always
it's
trying
you
to-
can have reverse discrimination as well. I lived in Sauganash, and my next door neighbor was Polish, and he's from Poland. His kid got a full ride to University of Chicago. He wasn't going to let him go there because they said he had to live on campus his freshman year. And my neighbor said no, because these American kids will corrupt him. We're better than they are. So see,
Yeah.
for everybody in the world, there's the other. We have to, I don't know why.
But his son will probably change that paradigm.
I would think
Oh,
so.
God, I hope so.
So thank you all so much. This was, thank you, Shattered Globe, for, is it 24 years?
25 to
25
years, so
of really
we're coming up on
amazing,
it. Yeah.
brilliant theater. Congratulations. Eileen, I just wanted to congratulate you. You were